Hello, I'm Joanne Diaz.
And I'm Abram Van Ingen.
And this is Poetry for All. Abram, as we're recording this, we are kind of getting back into school mode.
Yes, we are making lunches at home. We see all the kids waiting for the buses. We hope the buses stop. We hope the cars stop for the buses. It's all good things.
Yes, and that makes it a good time to remind teachers and students that our podcast can be of some use in the classroom, right?
In fact, we've heard from a lot of teachers who have used this in the classroom, everywhere from 8th grade to college. So, teachers, if you find us useful, use us.
Yes, absolutely. So for today's episode, we are going to read a poem by Jericho Brown titled Duplex.
Duplex. A poem is a gesture toward home. It makes dark demands I call my own. Memory makes demands darker than my own. My last love drove a burgundy car. My first love drove a burgundy car. He was fast and awful, tall as my father. Steadfast and awful, my tall father. Hit hard as a hailstorm, he'd leave marks. Light rain hits easy, but leaves its own mark, like the sound of a mother weeping again. Like the sound of my mother weeping again. No sound beating ends where it began. None of the beaten end up how we began. A poem is a gesture toward home.
Wow, that is a powerful poem. Unbelievable.
So situate this poem for me. It comes from a book called The Tradition, which I know won the Pulitzer Prize in 2020. But what is going on in the book?
So the book is, in many ways, speaking back to many poetic traditions, as well as political and historical and sexual. And so that title poem, The Tradition, it's a sonnet that starts with flowers and ends in police brutality. There's another sonnet called A Young Man. It starts ostensibly as a poem about family and then ends with the threat of incarceration. You see heroic couplets in a poem like The Water Lilies. There are multiple duplex poems in this book. So he's invented this duplex poetic form, and then in the book he shows you how many ways that duplex can allude to everything from the poetic speaker anticipating his own death, explorations of eros and desire, and in the case of this poem, thinking about violence from childhood and how it really stays deep in the memory of the poetic speaker. It's very, very powerful.
Yeah, the work of memory and the work of poetry coming together in this poem. We should talk about what makes a duplex, and just to get into the form itself for a little bit, if you don't see the poem in front of you, what you have here are 7 couplets. So that's 14 lines. And if you've listened to any of our podcasts over the last little bit, you'll know we've done a ton of sonnets. Sonnets are 14 lines. And so at a basic level, it's pulling from the idea of the sonnet. But it is also pulling from the idea of the ghazal. And that's a form that comes out of the Middle East. We have episode 63, with Hala Liza Ghaffori, who's doing Rumi. This is a form that Rumi used all the time. And that is where you leap from couplet to couplet all the way through a poem, making surprising connections. And so he's combined these two forms, and he's combined a sense of the blues and the blues poem in the way that he does the rhythm. So each line is syllabic. It's 9 to 11 syllables. And they don't necessarily rhyme in the classic sense of rhyming, but they rhyme in the sense of repetition. So the second line of each couplet is going to be repeated and changed in the first line of the next couplet. And you hear that as we go through the poem, and then the last line of the poem is going to repeat the first line of the poem. But we've gone on a journey by the time we've gotten there. It's completely changed by the time we've come back to that same line again.
It's an incredible form. And what you're describing, when you describe it theoretically, it sounds really complex, right? It's like this hybrid form, and it's doing all of these kinds of rhetorical and formal acrobatics. And yet, the poem itself, when you read it, was so direct. It was as clear as a bell. It was so emotionally powerful, right?
Yeah.
What it's doing is visual and spatial. And I think that's why I really wanted to talk about this poetic form, because this is a beautiful example of where poets are always thinking about the page as a visual field and quite often as a spatial or architectural field. So for Jericho Brown to call this a duplex, that is a very specific American form of housing, right? And he himself has described his interest in creating this form. He wanted to create a form that was distinctly Southern, distinctly part of the African American experience, a distinctly socioeconomic form. And what's interesting about a duplex form of housing is du means two, right? So it's two households that are yoked in one building and a wall separates them. And that's really interesting because you have this perceived notion that you are in your own unit, but that wall that divides those two units, that can be kind of thin sometimes, right? And you can sometimes hear what's going on across that wall or behind that wall. And that's really interesting to think about poetry. So if the open space in between stanzas is a kind of wall, you can hear what's picked up with a difference in the repetition in each new stanza, right?
So he has this great quote that he says about the duplex and why he called it a duplex. He says, because something about its repetition and its couplets made me feel like it was a house with two addresses. It is indeed a mutt of a form, as so many of us in this nation are only now empowered to live fully in all of our identities. I wanted to highlight the trouble of a wall between us who live within a single structure.
Wow. Oh my God. That's an amazing quote. And by the way, these quotes that we're citing of Jericho Brown's, a lot of them come from this amazing interview that he had with Michael Dumanis, who's the editor of the Bennington Review. And this is an interview that we will share on our webpage. Abram, I'm going to tell you the truth. I've probably read that interview like 5 or 6 times over the past few years.
It's really good.
It's so dense.
Yeah.
And like, if you want to get an insight, not only into Jericho Brown as a unique poetic voice, but also just how a poet of his intellect just is thinking on so many levels at once. It is so generative and inspiring. So everyone, don't just listen to this podcast, buy his book, The Tradition, and then read that amazing long interview because it is awesome. One of the best I've ever read.
I just want to say one other thing, too, about this invention of forms. I mean, we have forms that go back centuries, right? The sonnet is one of them. But forms keep being invented. They aren't done being invented. And one of the things we've emphasized on this podcast, partly just in us conversing about poetry, but partly in the poems themselves, that poetry is a conversation. And in Jericho Brown's The Tradition, it's a conversation with the tradition. And so this invention of a new form, it doesn't stand alone. I mean, we did another episode. It was on Joy Harjo's An American Sunrise, episode 48, where we looked at Terence Hayes' invention of a new form called the golden shovel, also a form invented in the last, 10, 15 years. And here you get another one. And this is another just sort of amazing quote that he writes about this and about participating in poetry this way. He says, part of the reason why I wanted to invent a form is because I wanted full participation for myself, but also for anyone who's writing after me in the tradition. And the way that you become a part of it is that you literally deal with it. You participate by writing in received forms, but also by creating forms for others to receive, and also by subverting forms, by thumbing your nose at them. And that's exactly what we get in this book.
Oh, that's so great, right? Because that last part of that quote in particular suggests a kind of argument, like a kind of argument with tradition, or a restlessness or a bristling against it until you create something of your own. That's so important. Another example from this podcast was Victoria Chang. She invented the obit form, right? Yeah. Yes, of course, it existed in traditional newspapers, but she resituated it as a poetic form, and then it has its own ripple effects. Very interesting.
So let's get into this poem itself, and we'll start with that first couplet. I'll read it, and you tell me what you see happening. A poem is a gesture toward home. It makes dark demands I call my own.
Wow, this is great. So this first couplet, these two lines, each line is its own sentence, and right away it identifies its interest in sound and meter. A poem is a gesture toward home. You can hear the iambic pentameter, right? Ba-bum, 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 ba-bum. And what's powerful about that iambic pentameter choice is that's a great meter for creating truth claims or observations that are very wise and insightful. A poem is a gesture toward home. A gesture toward home. It's like a nod or a pointing or a suggestion, right? It makes dark demands I call my own. That's interesting. So the poem makes those dark demands, but maybe home does too. I don't know. What do you think of that?
Exactly. I mean, I think when you start to get the equation between poem and home here, partly through the rhyme itself, you realize that what we're going to head into, and the poet almost doesn't know that he's heading into this himself, right? That's the surprise of this. But that once you call a poem like home, you realize this is a thing that is dark. First of all, there's some despair back there. There's some violence back there we're going to need to deal with. And there's a demand back there that it doesn't leave you, that it is your own and you got to call it your own. And so there's a way in which you got to claim it. And how are you going to claim it? Well, the next line, the next couplet leaps then into memory. And you can see how you'd leap into memory and also why it is surprising to leap from talking about what a poetry is to talking about memory, right? So the next couplet, memory makes demands darker than my own. My last love drove a burgundy car.
So what this does is creates an interesting leap in that juxtaposition between the first line of the couplet, memory makes demands darker than my own, which again feels like it's of the world of abstract commonplaces or truisms, right? My last love drove a burgundy car. It's so factual. It's just a detail in a declarative statement. That's all it is. It's so seemingly simple. But Abram, could you read the next couplet so that we can see what Jericho Brown does with that burgundy car?
My first love drove a burgundy car. He was fast and awful, tall as my father.
Wow, okay, so now there's a way in which the yoking of the first and the last through this inanimate object becomes very resonant and powerful, right?
Well, and what I love about it is that it mirrors the way memory works. I mean, it makes these strange leaps, associations. A burgundy car is just a burgundy car, but suddenly it's the thing that unites the most recent lover with the first lover. And then in the comparison, right, you were starting to move towards the father, towards that home that was gestured towards in the first line. He was fast and awful, tall as my father. And so memory is just making all of these leaps. And that, of course, is the ghazal form. But it's also the way memory works. And it's also what keeps binding things together, even as we're taking these sort of giant leaps.
And I think this is why lyrical poetry, yes, every poem has to have some narrative elements, but this is a fantastic lyric poem. Its song-like qualities create these leaps where you have to connect some of the dots, right? But the repetition helps with that as well. And wow, what a thing to have the first love, the last love, and the father just within 3 lines of each other. That's it. And then look what he does with that previous line of that last couplet. Look what he was fast and awful, tall as my father. Look what happens in the next couplet. Steadfast and awful, my tall father hit hard as a hailstorm. He'd leave marks.
So, of course, fast becomes steadfast. Awful remains awful. And we've talked in other poems. I mean, there's the County Cullen poem that we did where awful has these double meanings, right? Awful is a thing full of awe.
Yeah.
And terrible, dreadful, right? My tall father hit hard as a hailstorm. And there you get again, as becomes a super important word throughout this poem because it's always these comparisons that the mind makes, which leads to the next possible leap. And we're going to move from hailstorm to rain in the next couplet. But this is the way he hits. He hits hard as a hailstorm. And then we've talked before about short sentences are for power. And you get another sentence that is just 3 words long. Heed, leave, marks. And that repetition of that sound, heed, leave, also the sense that they're all 1-syllable words. You can't rush past them. You have to emphasize each one.
Oh, God, I'm just... I have to take a moment. It's incredible. Also, before we move on, I just want to call attention to the alignments of sound in the words, right? Awful and tall. And then, interestingly, use of alliteration, right? He hit hard as a hailstorm. He'd leave marks. There's a sense of sighing and exhaustion. And then, as you say, I love what you picked up on. Hailstorm is picked up with the next couplet with rain. Light rain hits easy, but leaves its own mark, like the sound of a mother weeping again. Oof, what do you see there?
Yeah, so again, a comparison makes the leap, right? So we move from hailstorm to rain. We recognize that rain can leave its own mark, even if it's soft. But the thing that the mind goes to understand that is the sound of a mother weeping again, right? So the again is also really important. It never passes. It keeps coming back. It repeats, like this poem itself has all these repetitions in it. And here in this couplet, it's the sound of a mother weeping again. But the big shift happens in the next line, the next couplet, like the sound of my mother weeping again. And by the way, this is the most repeated line, right? So in every case where the line is repeated with variation, there's a different amount of variation. In this one is the least amount of variation. The only variation is from a mother to my mother. So like the sound of a mother weeping again, now we get like the sound of my mother weeping again. And that amount of repetition both creates the sense and the hearing of that mother weeping again, but also drives home that this is not just any old mother, this is my mother. And that's the only variation that matters.
So this mother weeping, this is a figure that appears more than once in Jericho Brown's book, The Tradition, and he has a real concern with how and whether people are able to recognize the suffering of other humans, especially whether Americans are able to recognize the suffering of Black mothers weeping. And this is a very domestic, kind of personal poem, but I feel like it has ripple effects when it pushes against the other poems in that collection. So I just wanted to mention that too.
This is a very inclusive poem. Yes, it's about the poetic speaker and the memory and this particular home, but very much this poem wants to include anyone whose mother has wept and anyone who has been beaten, and that's where we're headed next. So like the sound of my mother weeping again, no sound beating ends where it began.
No sound beating ends where it began. That adjective sound really works on me. This is a poem that is so economical in every word choice, and it's actually very judicious in its use of adjectives. To use the adjective sound before beating, what does that mean, right? What does it mean about the pain, the suffering, the duration, the aftermath, and maybe not just on the person who's getting the beating, but the one who gives it? Because that's what gets to me about this poem, is that even though it is confronting this violence, it's thinking about it from multiple perspectives. And I find that that is a real act of empathy and desire to understand what really happened.
And then we get this generalization, this kind of truth claim that's picked up from the sound beating. None of the beaten end up how we began. A poem is a gesture toward home.
None of the beaten. That's really powerful because so much of the poem feels personal. Again, we end with these last two truth claims. None of the beaten end up how we began. And then we get the last line, which is identical to the first line of the poem. So structurally, we've already talked about how many forms the duplex form incorporates, but I'll give you another form though. It's almost like bookends, right? Or if you wanted to, you know how you can never cross the same river twice, right? It's almost like the poem starts in one place and returns to that place, but with a difference, right?
Absolutely. And Jericho Brown himself has a lot to say about this. I mean, he wants poems to go somewhere that maybe even the poet didn't know they were going to. Something has to be transformed. Something has to be changed in the writing of the poem, in the reading of the poem, in the journey of the poem. When a poem is a gesture toward home, it almost feels like the gesture is the part that comes to the fore. All it can do is gesture, but it can't quite get there because the home itself cannot be fully lived in.
Wow. Yeah, that's incredible.
With all that we've learned here, would you be willing to read this poem for us again?
Yes. Duplex. A poem is a gesture toward home. It makes dark demands I call my own. Memory makes demands darker than my own. My last love drove a burgundy car. My first love drove a burgundy car. He was fast and awful, tall as my father. Steadfast and awful, my tall father hit hard as a hailstorm. He'd leave marks. Light rain hits easy, but leaves its own mark, like the sound of a mother weeping again. Like the sound of my mother weeping again, no sound beating ends where it began. None of the beaten end up how we began. A poem is a gesture toward home.
Incredible.
Yeah.
So good.
Yeah.
Thanks for that. If you'd like to learn more about Jericho Brown, you can visit our website.
And we hope that you'll subscribe to this podcast wherever you download such things, whether it be Spotify, Apple, Google, whatever it is, and leave a review to let us know how we're doing.
And please be sure to follow us on Facebook, X, Instagram, YouTube, and our new Substack newsletter.
Thank you.